Okay, so again, the idea here is to get that API key, right? And I said at the end of the last one, hopefully you saw this, right? Like, don't push your code to GitHub yet. Not until you watch this video from me, and you'll see why in a minute. So, in the process of reading the documentation, that's a lot of what you're going to do when you're trying to figure out how to use an API is what do they need, right? So we know it's going to need a request object. Like I said before, it's going to need a post. Here's the URL. We know we've got a couple of headers we're going to use here. And now there's this part that I wasn't sure. This is the part that took me. I know there's these parameters. These are called parameters in this case. And here's the response, right? Here's the response I'm going to get back. And I kind of showed you that before. So the key was figuring out how to kind of do this piece because it was relatively easy to do this header piece because we've already learned about that. And I'll show you again in a moment. But part of this was just actually reading and trying to understand what it needed, right? And, in that process, it was great because for me, I actually got it working, but it took me a little time. I went into making requests, right? Made request, right? You can, and in this case, it's telling you to set up an external variable in this case. And I was thinking about that and I'm like, oh, that's right. Because the thing you want to think about in this case is the actual API key itself. So here's what I did, and I'm not going to show you my API key because I don't recommend you pushing your API key out to GitHub. Now the cool thing about your API key, and let's just go through this and then I'll talk about this, is here's what I ended up doing is I set up a method post. I set up the headers, which is the content type. Now the difference here was when it was showing it to you before, I think it was on the other one, yeah, where it was showing you what it needed. That was from the Python, this from the Node.js, right? And actually that's not even from the chat one. Yeah, there's a chat completion. All right, here's the messages. But it was going to have you install this OpenAI program. So you needed to install that and call, once you imported it. And I'm like, no, I want to do it simply. I don't want to do it with any of the libraries. So that's where I figured out, based on the way it was showing me the examples, right? If I did JavaScript one line function, let's see if it was giving it to me. Right? So even here, it was having me actually set up the import OS, right? Import Open API, and then reference the key itself. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do it with pure client-side JavaScript. So getting it to work meant I needed to do the headers. I needed to do the single quotes here. And this I found on Stack Overflow was that in addition to the headers, I needed another key called body. And I needed to JSON stringify it, give it then the model and the message I wanted to send. So the role and the content as I showed you on the first video. Now this is the part that took me a few minutes because this code we already had from the other video, and then using this as the URL, the fetch URL that we were going after. Okay. Now he put that in a variable and I could have done that here. But the other thing, and I'm wondering how many of you actually thought of this right away, just go ask chat, right? And so I did. After I got it working, I went and asked chat about it. And here's what it did. It actually wanted me to do it in Node. And here's why. And this is good to understand. And this is why I didn't want you to push your code. Okay. Is like, here's my prompt. I'll show you my prompts, right? Can you help me make an OpenAI API fetch call from client-side JavaScript? It says, of course, you can use it, right? Directly, may expose your API key. And I'm like, oh, that's right. right? And this is where using a server-side proxy, that's why using Python and using Node.js, because hopefully you know, if you don't, Node.js is server-side JavaScript, makes a lot more sense, okay? But this showed me how to set up the form, right? How to listen for it, how to get the items, how to make the call, right? And this is where it actually even showed me, right? Here's the, in this case, Darwin. Okay, so that's what the call it made, my bearer, and this was the body, right? So it wasn't exactly what I wrote. It was pretty close though. The other thing it did is it handled the error, right? If it's okay, and here we handled the error, right? And here, right? So I would recommend on your own, right? Right? Do this prompt. Can you help me make fetch client side, right? And then after I did that, my next question is, can you give me information about using server proxy for the API key? And so this is where it actually went through and said, okay, set up node, which by the way, you guys did at the beginning of this class. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. You could totally play around with this, right? And so here is using Express, which of course, beyond the scope of this class. But this is where running endpoints that you can then call. So these are server endpoints that you can use fetch then to make these calls, make these endpoint API calls. So you're writing. So in this case, we're switching in from, instead of calling an API, we're writing the API that we're then calling. And what this allows you to do is hide that API key on the server so it's not sniffable. If you don't know that term, right, it's the idea we don't want to expose it. Now, the good news is on ChatGPT, you can actually regenerate your code, your key. So if you happen to push it, it's okay, you could regenerate it. So what I did is, just so I could show the code, is I created a key.js and I imported it. But of course, before I push my code, I'm going to clear out that file. That's also, by the way, where you could use your gitignore file here. You could use your gitignore file to ignore that specific one. But there's something called .env that is used to help hide that API key. But notice what I did is I just came in here and I injected into the authorization. So you can play with this, if you want on your side. Don't push your key out there, right? In this case, right, I'm not actually going to make you for this assignment. What I want you to do is give me your feedback, right, on how I approach this. I'm curious how many of you automatically thought, just go ask Chat GDP how to do it. So here's the lesson I'm trying to actually drill home for you, is that I like having tried it first, because then I gave myself an opportunity to put into practice how to actually write this header object on my own. And without that, if you just rely on somebody telling you, right, then I don't think you gain as much knowledge. So I'm curious, right? Kind of just any part of this that I went through, right? Again, you don't have to have working code here. If you do, I recommend, don't when you push it to the server, don't have your key in there, because we are, all of us, pushing these to public GitHub repos, and we don't want those keys exposed. But again, the exposure is relatively small because the API allows us to go in and create a new one. So you can get rid of the old one and create a new one. But still, it's good to understand, more than anything, that why we wouldn't, right? In this case, writing the fetch on the client side is great, but we need a way to hide the API. And that is why using something on the server is really more where we place some of this hidden, especially the API key, but hidden other configuration things that we would need to make these API calls. So I know I've talked about quite a bit of different things here. So, I just want to see in your README file here. I will look at the code. It doesn't it doesn't have to run, but I want to see that you wrote it, and I want to see that you gave me some thoughts. So I think this is a new file for this folder you'll create for this one. All right, so this will be it for this section, and then you'll go on to local storage for your app development. See you later.